Hi, everyone. This is Joelle from Cleveland, Ohio, and today I'm here with
Dr. Hutton.
Okay. Today I'm here with Dr. Hutton, a professor at UC Davis and an accomplished author. So how are you, Dr. Hutton?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
The sun is finally out here in Cleveland, so it's starting to feel like spring. How's the weather in California?
Well, actually, we're cloudy today, which is very disappointing. You're much more lucky in Cleveland.
That's a rarity.
Yes, absolutely.
So before we begin with my questions, I just want to sincerely thank you for deciding to do this interview with me, as I know you must be like really busy with the semester ending. So as I said, I'm having a little trouble finding specific details for my topic of women in the Middle Ages. So I'm very excited that I have this opportunity to hear from the author of Women and Economic Activities in Late Medieval Gent. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let's get right to it. Okay, so what rights did women have in the Middle Ages?
Well, first, the first thing you need to understand about the Middle Ages is what rights people had depended on what group they were in. That is, people were born into certain groups, and that determined what rights they had. Mm-hmm. For example, if a girl was born to a peasant family, she was going to be a peasant all of her life. Mm-hmm. Maybe she could go to a town and live there, but she was never going to be in the nobility. So as a peasant woman, she would have certain rights, okay? So mm-hmm. If a woman was born into the nobility, then it would depend on the rights that her family had. And it would depend also on how many brothers she had and what the inheritance rules were. Mm-hmm. So for example, if a woman was born into a family and she didn't have any brothers or her brothers died and she was the oldest girl, then she would inherit the family's property. And that actually would give her a lot of power because then she would have all that property. And even though she would be expected to marry and her husband would take over managing that property, she would still have a lot of influence because it was her property.
Right.
Okay. So it really depends on the circumstances of being born, much more so than it did today. You know, today that doesn't matter as much, but boy, it really mattered in the Middle Ages. So there are more opportunities for power for a woman of the nobility. Now, even if a woman in the nobility did not inherit all of the property, because she did have brothers, when she got married, she would be expected to manage all of her husband's properties and even lead his armies in battle and defend the castle when her husband was away. And so, you know, medieval noble women, they actually arranged, they were very, very powerful. They would order hundreds of women and men around the castle because that was their responsibility to take care of it. So these are women who are like basically running corporations. If you think about it, they're running a big medieval castle and organizing all of those people, and all those people are listening to their orders. So medieval noble women were important if their families and their husbands were important that way. Okay, so I told you, but now another thing to consider is that women's rights were dependent on their marital status. That is, in most places in Europe, a woman owned property and could control her property when she was single or when she was a widow. But if she was married, that property and everything she owned belonged to her husband.
Oh.
So during her marriage, she wasn't a legal person at all. And the name of this rule is called coverture, C-O-V-E-R-T-U-R-E. And that law means that she isn't even a legal person, that her husband had complete authority over her in marriage.
Wow.
So this is a significant legal disability that women had.
Right.
Okay? And actually that happened, that continued, carried over to America. And in early America, until the middle of the 1800s, it was the law for women in the United States too.
Right, we've learned about how, like, I know, like, in the Middle Ages, when the men would go to, like, war, the women would have to step in and, like, run the house and the property.
Right, so, and sometimes it even defended the castle. There are lots of stories about the wife. You know, she didn't. She probably have a soldier there who would actually order the troops, but she would be the one who would organize the defense and decide when the castle would surrender or not surrender if she was attacked while her husband was gone. So there are lots of stories about medieval women who sort of either surrender or don't surrender when their castle is attacked. So, you know, so I promised to tell you about Eleanor of Aquitaine. She's probably the most powerful woman of the Central Middle Ages. So Eleanor of Aquitaine was she was the daughter of the Duke of Aquitaine, which is this huge province in southwest France. Okay, and so she inherited a huge chunk of what is today the country of France, and she had no brothers. She was the oldest girl and had no brothers. So her father died when she was 15 years old, and her father's feudal lord was the King of France. So the King of France took over as Eleanor's guardian, and he arranged a marriage for her. And not surprisingly, he married her to his son because he wanted that big chunk of property to go to her. Okay. Right. So the son's name was Louis. That the French kings liked the name Louis. He was Louis VII. Okay. So Eleanor was married to Louis VII. But they did not have a very happy marriage. They were married for about 12 years and they had 2 girls. And so Louis was very disappointed because he wanted to have a son. Okay. But Eleanor and Louis were also of sort of different temperaments. Louis was very religious, and Eleanor was liked to you know, entertain in the castle. She was a patron of troubadour poets and, you know, courtly love. And she liked to have a kind of a lively court and dance and listen to poetry and so forth. So they didn't get along, it seems, in their personal lives. So the 2 of them went together on the Second Crusade. And so Eleanor is one of the few women who ever went on the Crusades. And the reason she went on the Crusades is a group of knights swore allegiance to her as their feudal lord, not to Louis. So all of these knights from Aquitaine actually came because Eleanor was their lady, not because they fought for France. So she was their leader, so she went with Louis on the crusade. And so when on the crusade, they stopped at Antioch, which was one of the towns in Outremer, the Crusader states, and Eleanor's uncle was the Prince of Antioch. And so historians don't know exactly what happened, but apparently Eleanor was having too good a time in Antioch, and her husband got mad, and what he did was send his soldiers into her bedroom, grab her, take her out of the castle by force, stick her on a horse, and ride away from Antioch. So he basically took her against her will out of Antioch to get her away. And so she never forgave him for that. She was really mad at him. And finally, a couple of years later, they got a divorce. Now, I know you've probably heard that divorce was not allowed in the Middle Ages, but you could get a divorce if you claimed if you could get the Pope to to annul your marriage, to say that your marriage was never had broken the religious rules. And what Louis and Eleanor claimed was that they were too closely related when they were married. It's just an excuse, but the Pope went along with it because they wanted to make Louis happy. Okay. So the Pope granted them a divorce. And this is the biggest mistake that Louis ever made, because Eleanor got married next to the King of England. And so she got married to King Henry II of England. And the reason it was a problem for Louis is that all of the lands in France that belonged to Eleanor now belonged to Henry and belonged to England.
Mm.
And so Eleanor's children inherited all part of France, and this led to some later wars. Okay, so anyway, when Eleanor married Henry, she
Mm-hmm.
took all of her lands and all of her property with her, and it became Henry's during the marriage and was later inherited by her children. See, so that you see how the property gave her a lot of power?
Yeah. Right.
Okay, so when, yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, I've read a lot about how like women didn't really have much control over their lives. Like they were, the marriages were arranged, and um,
Right.
right, like so that definitely.
Yeah, that's definitely very hard to accept. You know, well, that happened to Eleanor because when she was 15, she didn't have any choice of that she was going to marry Louis. But you know, in the Middle Ages, people didn't think that you should marry for love. Even although we think that peasants had more choices over their marriage, medieval people thought it was very silly to get married for love. They thought it was a recipe for disaster because they thought that you should marry somebody who had property and good social status so you would be protected in your life. So it was just kind of a different world, a different belief system. But of course, that did cause a lot of problems. And the story of Eleanor and Louis really shows that they really did not like each other at all and probably never should have been married. But I got to tell you, the end part is that Eleanor went on to have 7 children with Henry, including 5 boys. So that really irritated Louis too. And 2 of those boys grew up to be kings of England. That is Richard the Lionheart and John were both Eleanor of Aquitaine's sons. So she's a really good example of a very powerful woman because she had property and because she had tremendous influence over in the courts.
Right. So if you weren't born into royalty or into like a higher social class, and you were kind of like more of a peasant, what jobs did they have? Like what options besides, I know a lot of women stayed in the house and cleaned and cooked, but and cared for the children. But I know there were some like women who did have jobs.
Yes. Yes, they did. The biggest job that most women did that we don't think of today as housework is spinning. That is, spinning took an enormous amount of time, and women did it all. Just they did it. It was before the spinning wheel, so they did it with. It just took enormous amounts of time. But there were women in Paris who worked in making silk garments, and they were actually in guilds. So there were women's guilds in Paris of making silk goods. There were also women who were healers and midwives. That is, a lot of the doctors for the poor were actually women, and women delivered all the babies. That no men were ever involved in that. Women worked at almost every job that you can imagine in the Middle Ages. Lots of them were market sellers, and they worked alongside their husbands in almost every kind of a job. And they don't usually get credit for it because everybody thought of the husband as being the head of the household, but the women would do those jobs. So we know of women who were, lots of women sold things. So they were what we call mercers, which is kind of like a grocery shop owners. They sold all, vegetables and eggs and all different kinds of things in markets. They sold cloth. They dyed cloth. They were dyers often. Let's see, gold workers sometimes, making intricate things of gold. Particularly, they used to put threads of gold on silk, like a decoration on silk to make beautiful garments. And women did all of that work. So women did lots of jobs in the Middle Ages, sometimes recognized as in the guilds, and sometimes working in a household.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I know like the fact that women worked alongside men because men get the credit for especially like physically physically grueling jobs, but Yeah.
Well,
So,
that's what the research that I do was showed a lot of that. And I actually found that even though women weren't supposed to go to court when they were married, I found out they actually did. That a lot of times husbands didn't care if their wives went and managed property and did that. So I found out that women did actually a lot of jobs. And it seems like a lot of men didn't really, they must have supported it because they didn't object to their wives doing it. And so forth. So I think in practice in certain places, women did a lot more than we think they did. Sometimes we pay too much attention to what certain people wrote down as the rules.
right.
People broke the rules.
Do you think the church had any say in whether women should work alongside men, whether women should have the same jobs as men? Like, what was the church's stance on this, like the whole issue?
Well, I have two parts to that answer. One part is that I think the church was probably just sometimes people think of the church as being the one that orders women not to be equal to men. And I don't think that that was really true in the Middle Ages. I think that people believed that women should be subordinate to men, that men should be on top and women should be below, and that men in the church believed that also. So I don't think that they were any more strict than regular society. And then the second thing I want to mention to you is remember that in the church, women could become nuns. And I know that this doesn't sound very exciting today, but in the Middle Ages, where a woman was expected to get married, if you didn't want to get married, or if you wanted to get an education, you could become a nun. And lots of women became highly educated and respected as nuns in the Middle Ages. We have a number of women who became scholars and authors that way, like Hildegard of Bingen, who actually became a doctor of the church. That is, the church recognized her as being a mystic with inspiration from God, that she and teaching in theology. So she's got a really high position. She was really respected in the church. Another woman was Catherine of Siena, and Catherine of Siena was so respected that she even wrote letters to the Pope telling the Pope he was doing a bad job and needed to clean up Rome. And he listened to her. I mean, he respected her in that way because of her religious stance. So actually in the church, women had a kind of an avenue to power because they could be very educated and they could have spiritual authority, and men in the church would listen to them if they thought that those women were actually respectable and had a strong spiritual mission. So sometimes the church actually gave women more opportunities for power rather than taking it away from them. So I know that makes what you're saying really complicated, but that's kind of the way it was.
So now, like nowadays, gender discrimination is definitely on the forefront. And I know during the Middle Ages there was lots of conflict and lots of, which is why I think they called it the Dark Ages. Lots of a downside step in like society. But do you think that they focused at all on gender discrimination, like during the Middle Ages? Like, do you think women ever thought it was unfair, or was it just the norm in society?
Well, first I would like to say that I don't like the word Dark Ages because I think that it wasn't a dark age. That because I think sometimes people in later times thought that I think the Middle Ages was a lot more important and a lot more things happened in the Middle Ages than some people give credit to it. But I also think that there were a lot of issues in society, and sometimes probably the majority of women accepted it. But there is, in the late part of the Middle Ages, there is in literature a kind of a debate between men and women, and you have women's authors who actually defend women and talk about how men don't treat women properly. And this is called the argument about women in literature. And the most famous woman who writes in it is a woman named Christine de Pizan. And Christine de Pizan was actually a professional writer. She's the first woman professional writer. And she worked, she had as patrons the Queen of France and members of the French nobility. And she wrote stories about how women had been very patient while men had been treating them very badly. So she actually answered that by talking about how women were actually better than men, that men had behaved badly, but women sometimes behaved much better than the men did. And she actually retold a bunch of stories from a bunch of legends from the past where women had done bad things, and rewrote it as if the men had done the bad things and the women had been the heroes of the story, of the good guys that way. So yes, there was quite a bit of argument about whether about that, and I think that probably people talked about the injustices of men and women the same way that they do today. That is, but a lot of times they didn't write those things down, so we don't know what they say. But yes, I think the issue of gender relations came up. Yes, absolutely. I think it's always probably come up. Yeah, because, it's really important how men and women get along.
Right. And I wanted to really understand like the source of where like women's inferiority in relation to men like began. And I was really like fascinated. I was reading things that said like back to like Adam and Eve, and like Eve was the one who sinned, so she was considered like I guess worse than Adam. And so I'm sure everybody's opinions differ, but in your opinion, where do you like think that like gender relations and women's inferiority to men's began?
Well, there's a word that you should use for that, and the word of it is patriarchy. Patriarchy means the domination of men over women. So the historical word you want to use for that, patriarchy is the system where men rule over women, and men are expected to be better or thought to be better than women. And I got to tell you, I teach world history, and every single society that we have that had writing had patriarchy. So it starts very, very early. Personally, some historians have done work on trying to figure out where it got started. And I think that there is not a whole lot of evidence, but the one beginning that I think makes the most sense is that probably patriarchy started because men wanted to make sure that their sons would inherit their property. And in order to do that, the men would have to control the property, and the men would have to be sure that women were under their control so that their sons would inherit.
May I have your attention? We need an interpreter in the...
We apologize for the interruption and announcement from the PA system at the public school.
Of course, that always happens. Anyway, so that it probably started then. But, I think it also goes to this, Joelle, if you think about it, that if all those arguments about Adam and Eve and so forth, these are all justifications. That is, men wanted to have the power over women. They wanted to maintain the status quo. So they made up all of these justifications to say, well, that's why it goes back to Adam and Eve, because they thought that was the beginning of the world. And then they would also argue, they would say, well, God intended it to be that way. God intended men to be over women. But that's just a justification. They wanted the power and control over women in that way. Now, so it goes back a long, long, long time in that way. And maybe it goes back to the fact that men are physically stronger than women are.
Right.
I don't know, but I do think it's been around for a very long time.
Yeah. I'm sure in every like if you trace it back in every society.
Society I know about, yes, absolutely. But it also, so what we have to do though is there are also variations in patriarchy. That is, in some societies, women had certain rights and certain protections, and in other societies they didn't. So when we study the past, when women's historians study the past, what we have to do is look at what were the exact rights that women had under patriarchy in this society at this time compared to the exact rights they had in other places too. Like you have to look at the fact, yes, medieval women were under patriarchy, but they also had property rights.
Right.
Rights to property when they were single, you know, yes, women couldn't do jobs that men did, or they didn't get recognition for jobs, but that didn't mean that they didn't work. So we have to kind of look at it that way.
So, I think with as society progresses, we've made a lot of advancements in just women's rights. You know, not too long ago, women weren't able to vote, and in some societies they still can't. So, what do you think has changed that, or what modern what has changed? Why have we accepted women differently than they did before?
Because I think women fought very hard for their rights. That is, women fought very hard for the rights of suffrage. For 72 years in the United States, the women's rights movement tried to get suffrage for women from 1848 until 1920 when the amendment finally passed. And then also there was the women's movement of the late 1960s and the 1970s. And the women's movement fought very, very hard for women to have equal rights and so forth. And then there are laws that were passed. You know, in my lifetime, I can think about in 1964, a law was passed. The Civil Rights Act was passed, and it said that that there couldn't be discrimination on the basis of race or sex. And so that meant that the people had to give couldn't discriminate against women in employment and loans and all the housing and all different kinds of areas. Then there's also in 1972 a law was passed, equal pay law, that where employers had to pay men and women the same amount of money for the same jobs. Okay, and then there's also there's a law passed, the Title IX law that was passed in the 1970s, which said if there's a boys' sport at a school, there has to be a girls' sport the same way. And so before that time, there were no girls' sports at all in school. There were no girls' teams. And now there are because of Title IX. And, you know, many more women are, I think that women fought very hard for those rights, and that in society, we have to remember that but women need to take advantages of those rights and that we have at this time and stand up for other women.
Right. I think, I don't know, sometimes even women take for granted the things that I mean, in some countries, women can't even drive. And I think that some women just, I don't know, take it, forget. They think they only see what we don't get, the discrimination, but they don't see what we do have and what we've accomplished. And I think that just goes back to the Middle Ages. We always thought, you know, when we read in textbooks about how women were subservient or whatever to men and they had to stay in the house, but maybe they did have more, as you've been saying, more rights and than we've thought.
You know, something else, I think that, let me give you another example that would help too. One thing that would shock us terribly about the Middle Ages is that husbands got to beat up their wives, that they could beat their wives. And of course, today, that's a huge issue that feminists fight, you know, that feminists have been trying to defend other women to say, you know, that battered women's shelters and things like that to protect women who were beaten. But in the Middle Ages, nobody would object if a husband beat his wife. And so, that was a terrible thing to think of husbands. If he got mad at her, he could just, beat her up. He couldn't kill her. He couldn't beat her to death, but he could beat her really, really badly. And, we think about that right in the past, that nobody would even question that in the Middle Ages. So, in some major ways, women were very, had these huge disabilities in that time period. And those are things that women don't face today. So, also in the sense of rights, there's also medieval people had some really different ideas about that. They also believed that parents could beat children and actually should beat children, because that's the only way they would learn, So it was kind of an idea of violence that today we would really reject. We would say, oh, that's horrible, that men could beat up on women like that. And probably women beat up on children too,
Right.
Just because they believed it was okay to do that. And today we don't.
Right. I've like,
yeah.
oh, go ahead. Oh, I was just in my research, like I was looking up how women and like how their interaction with their kids, and it definitely said that they were very strict, and that they would like whip their kids if they were bad, and that was the only way that they would learn.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of hard for us to understand why that was, was considered to be all right, but it was just part of medieval upbringing. It happened to everybody. Crazy, absolutely. Absolutely. So, in your question of, when you talk about your topic of justice, too, I think that you can see some cases in the Middle Ages where people were treated very unjustly, like, say, Eleanor being taken by her husband and just, seized physically and placed on a horse and taken away. That's not really right by our standards today. But according to the standards of the Middle Ages, he had the right to do that. So, it makes it a difficult topic. I think that's why it was important for some women to be nuns and to decide that they didn't want to get married at all, that they would rather live in a place where they would not have to get married and they could become educated. That a lot of women just did not want to, it gave women a choice that they could go into into a convent or into some kind of a religious life, and then they would be able to maintain their single status and wouldn't have to listen to a man. And that's why it's important, because they had that outlet.
Mm-hmm. I know, like before we began the essay, and even at the beginning of the year, we talked about like questions that don't really have an answer, like what is justice? Because I think in each society and each time period that really differed. So to us, we can look back and say, wow, like why would women think that's okay? Why would they just, accept that men beat them up? But I think now our definition of like what is justice has definitely changed.
Yeah. So someday, I always tell my students is that someday, 200 years from now, people will look back at us and say, oh my goodness, how could they put up with this thing? How could they not understand that? Say, for example, treating animals, oh, how could they think that animals were animals? How come they didn't realize that they really could communicate and things like that, and we're going, what? We don't even recognize it. But you're very smart to realize that at a young age. It's hard, historians work very, very hard to try to remember that we can't judge the past by our standards. Mm-hmm. That they had a different set of standards that they were trying to live under. Yeah. The other thing to remember when you're talking about justice too is that gender isn't the only difference in society. There were also differences of class, like between peasants and nuns and peasants and the clergy and the nobility and townspeople all had different status. and also differences of location. That is, it wasn't the same situation in England as it was in France or in the Italian cities or places like that. For example, in the Italian cities, women whose families were in the elite, in the upper groups in there, they never let girls and women go out at all without a chaperone. These women were supposed to stay at home all the time. But in the northern cities, in France and Flanders and England, women went outside all the time. And they did all the shopping. They went and did shopping every day. They visited, they worked in the public, they sold things to people in the public. It was just no problem. But down in Southern Europe, it was, oh no, women have to stay, they have to be very, very closely supervised. And they're supposed to stay in the house, you know, but in the North, that wasn't even the rule. So there are differences in place as well as in social class and in gender.
Right. So I believe you studied a specific area in Belgium. Is that correct?
Yeah. And it was called Flanders, and it was a really important area of a lot of towns where they made wool cloth. And so a lot of women worked at making wool cloth.
So what like interests you to just study that specific? Was there anything that stuck out like specifically versus any other area in Europe?
Well, two things interested me about it. First, not a lot of people had done research on this area. So there's a lot of research on England. There's a lot of research on France and on Italy, but on this little area, because most of the records were in the Dutch language and most didn't read Dutch, they hadn't investigated these sources. That was one thing. And then secondly, I found out that women actually had more rights there than they did in other places. That is, women were, there are a lot of women in the records. I found that of all the little court records that I studied, that women were in 25% of the court cases. So every court case out of 4, these contracts and so forth. So women were really, really active. And I wanted to find out why that was.
Yeah.
Why was, you know, how could they be so active? Why could they do these things? I found out that women loaned money, that they had a lot of money. And the reason that they were so active, I think, is because the rule in Flanders for inheritance was that all the sons and daughters inherited an equal amount of property. That is, not just the sons inherited the property, but all of the daughters too. So every single woman in Flanders, if her family had any money at all, every woman was an heiress. Every woman had property. And so and sometimes they loaned that, they made loans on that property and then were paid back with interest, so that would give them money. They invested, probably invested in businesses, and that they also managed their property. We see that in the court cases. You know, they bought and sold property, and they also sometimes sued. So we can see from those records of the suit that they were active in managing their property. And that's what really interests me.
Well, that is very interesting that in like the same time period, there could be such a difference. So why, why do you believe that area was such like viewed women so differently from like other areas and like just?
I think the main reason that area was different, one reason is because its inheritance customs were different. Then those inheritance customs had developed earlier time, and I think that it's just people kind of followed it because it was the way it was always done. And then the second thing is I think it was useful because of the cloth industry. They needed a lot of women to work at spinning, and particularly spinning, because that just takes took so much time. And they needed a lot of women to be able to work at spinning. And when women can earn money and they're important to the economy, it gives them a kind of power. And I think that they thought women were useful, that women could kind of organize other women. I found out that there are these women who are drapers, in which they're the ones who pay for the cloth and organize it through the production process. And these women were, you know, organizing 10 or 15 spinners and bringing things together and hiring a weaver to weave it and hiring a dyer and so forth. And it was very, very useful to have these women working at sort of middle level positions. They didn't make a tremendous amount of money. All the really important and profitable jobs were held by men, but to have women on that middle level was very useful to men. So I think that's why they were able to get that kind of power in that time period.
So money definitely helped women, and helped maybe if that area was, if they had this cloth industry, if they were here, that definitely helped society. Yeah.
It helped women. And then, because then what happens is when the cloth industry becomes less profitable and you have a recession, you have a really bad recession in Flanders, then they start cracking down and they start, you see the women disappeared from the records. That is, men were saying, okay, well, she's a woman. I deserve to have this job now. So in times of prosperity, I think women kind of got to expand more. But then there's always, if there is competition, then men can always back down and say, oh, well, she's not legitimate. And women shouldn't be doing this kind of work. And you see that kind of crackdown happen. But I always, women had to be useful to men in that way. And well, of course that's not right maybe, but it's a factor that gave them power. But the other thing that women do, Joelle, I really believe this from studying women's history, is that there are these laws and prohibitions on women, and they say, oh, only men can have this job. This is just set off. But then what women do is they kind of flow around those barriers and they find opportunities, and they, you know, find some jobs or professions that men don't think is very useful, and they just expand those areas and expand their power. And that's what they've done all throughout history. So you've got patriarchy, but you've also got resistance to patriarchy all through history.
Right. I just want to make sure we're okay on time. I don't know when you have to leave.
Well, you know, I have probably told you, if I've answered your questions, then probably I should let you go. It's up to you. If you have more to ask, I could do more time. But if this is enough material for you, that's fine for me.
Well, just one more question. Is there anything that you feel I should know, or if you think that would help me with my essay, or something that you feel I should know about, whether it has to do with justice or the Middle Ages or women or anything really?
Oh man, I think I've given you my best examples. So let me just tell you that there's some women that you could look up to give you maybe more evidence for your paper. And that would be, you could look up Christine de Pizan, okay? And you could look up Eleanor of Aquitaine, and you could Hildegard of Bingen, and I can write out these names. I can spell them for you in an email if that would be helpful, because I know the names are really strange. But I think that those women would be very good examples for your paper if you wanted to point out women who were doing things that were that supported the cause of or showed that women did have some power in this time period. That those are probably the best examples that I have for you. But there are other women as well. So if you need more, maybe you could email me. Just email me, and I could come up with some more names for you, and maybe tell you books I don't know. Okay? Anything you want.
Thank you so much. All your answers are really going to help me with my research paper. I'm really happy that I got this opportunity, and I'm happy that you were able to take this time to interview with me. Mr. Holman, do you have anything to add?
No, I think we'll stop the live recording now and give you guys a chance to talk. But again, on behalf of Beechwood, Middle School, thank you so much for taking time away from your busy schedule at the end of the semester and to meet with us and have a conversation about women's rights throughout history. And she's very excited about what she's doing, and I think it's helpful for her to talk to people who know a lot more than I do about the topic. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording and give you a chance just to say goodbye.